Hello and welcome to the Whitehall Sources podcast, where we take you inside politics at Westminster, down Whitehall and beyond. I'm Callum MacDonald, and also on this podcast, of course, are Kirsty Buchanan, who was a special advisor to the Prime Minister Theresa May. Hello, Kirsty.
Hello to you.
Hiya, and Joe Tanner's with us, political strategist who works cross-party to infuse some wisdom into politics today. Hello, Joe.
Hello.
Great to have you both here. On the podcast today, really one story, one issue certainly in town. And actually in the week since we last spoke, can you believe it's only been a week, President Trump has upended the world order. He's brought Russia and Vladimir Putin in from the cold of a diplomatic freeze. He's navigating towards talks for peace in Ukraine, suggested that Ukraine has started the war with Russia, despite the fact that Putin invaded Ukraine's sovereign territory. And President Trump's also caused one emergency meeting of European leaders so far, although French President Emmanuel Macron will host a second meeting with European leaders in just a few hours at the time of recording. So we're here on the afternoon of Wednesday, the 19th of February. Meanwhile, Keith Kellogg, who's America's special envoy for Ukraine, has arrived in Kyiv this morning for what feels like the first proper inclusion of Ukraine in whatever this next chapter is going to hold. Kirsty, this level of upheaval in how the world is functioning, it has been a week since that phone call with Vladimir Putin and President Trump. Are we justified in the feeling of surprise we have, given, to some extent at least, President Trump is basically doing what he said he would do, or at worst, perhaps we could have predicted that he was going to do?
No, I think for once the general sense of shock is entirely justified. The events of the last 24 hours have been nothing short of extraordinary, and I, like most people, are struggling to remember a time when I have ever seen an intervention quite like this. Not only has he effectively brought Russia back in from the cold, he has all but ruled out membership for NATO for the Ukraine, not just now, but in perpetuity. He has peddled, at best, Putin propaganda about Zelensky's levels of support at home, claiming that they are now at 4%, where actually they're closer to 60%. And he seems to be towing the Putin line about wanting an election to be held in Ukraine. And this is just, we're all still waiting to see what concessions, if any, are being asked of Russia. So far, so nothing. I watched Zelensky this morning give a press conference where I thought, under the circumstances, he was remarkably tempered in his criticism of Trump, and said Trump is, being surrounded by, dare I say it, fake news about his rating and his views of Ukraine. But to say that Ukraine started this war is just, regardless of anything else, just factually inaccurate.
Wrong. Yeah.
And I don't understand how much disinformation you need to be surrounded by to just not be able to tell the blindingly obvious from a lie.
Yeah, and Joel, that does seem a little like the kind of theme of the day. President Zelensky of Ukraine saying US President Donald Trump is living in a disinformation space fueled by Russia. One of my thoughts on that is this apparent friction between Ukraine and the USA doesn't seem that conducive to the progress that everybody hopes is made, albeit with the support of Ukraine for that process.
Yeah, and it's just waters that are continuing to muddy, because in this age of information overload from all different sources, we're seeing ex-defense secretaries coming out and putting threads on X about what their truth is, or what they see the truth as being. We're seeing sort of comments coming from ex-prime ministers. We've seen Boris already release a statement. We're sort of, the noise is off as well. If it wasn't bad enough with the individuals involved and the sort of the range of views and misinformation that we're seeing, and then you get a load of other people who sort of pile in off the back of it. So it's just like everyone has a right to have an opinion, and a lot of them aren't particularly well informed. So it just makes for a diplomatic mess.
Yeah, well, indeed. To try to get some insight and certainly some expertise and analysis, let's welcome Sir David Manning to the podcast. Sir David was Britain's ambassador to the USA and to Israel. He was head of the Defence and Overseas Secretariat from 2001 to 2003, a foreign policy advisor to the Prime Minister, Sir Tony Blair, and he's now a director of Gatehouse Advisory Partners. Sir David, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Callum.
It's so good to have you here, given all that's going on. I suppose let's start kind of broadly on this, and then we'll start focusing in. But there is a feeling, isn't there, that European officials are somewhat awakening to the reality that Donald Trump has emphasised for quite some time that the US doesn't want to be a guarantor, certainly the primary guarantor of security for either Ukraine or indeed the continent of Europe anymore.
Well, they may be awakening to it in the sense that they now have been more or less told that that is what he wants to do. I think there were hopes in the run-up to the election that he would modify that position and that his approach to the transatlantic relationship would turn out to be a much more positive one than seems likely at the moment. I think everybody was braced for the fact that he was going to say, you have to contribute far more to your own defence. My priority is going to be China. But I think a lot of people hoped that he would take a different line on Ukraine and that he would be more willing to back the transatlantic alliance, which has been in place, after all, since just after the Second World War. I think all those things now are up for grabs and in doubt.
What position does that leave security in and diplomacy in as well? As we're kind of hinting at already on this episode, there are tensions between Europe and the US, between Ukraine and the US, and suddenly the shadow of Russia is being cast across all of these countries, given its apparent welcome back in by President Trump.
Europeans will have seen the last month since Trump came back to the presidency as one of great uncertainty. It's now very unclear what his approach is going to be to European security and to relationships with Russia. There are obvious tensions about this, and the difficulty is trying to establish exactly, how he intends to approach this over the medium and long term. We can see that the policy towards Ukraine is, if you like, has been turned on its head. His predecessor was staunch in his support for Ukraine. We now have an American president apparently blaming the victim for the Russian invasion of Ukraine. This was a vicious and illegal act by the Russians. We're now being told that this was provoked by the Ukrainians themselves. We're being told that a deal could easily have been done, but the deal that seems to be being sketched out amounts, in effect, to it's easy to do the deal as long as you surrender. And so we're in a completely new environment. The Europeans have been staunch in their support for Ukraine over a long period, as was the Biden administration. Europeans, in fact, have spent more in Ukraine's defense than the United States has. And they remain committed to the Ukrainians being allowed to, of course, be party to any negotiations, but also to come out with a peace deal that guarantees their sovereignty, their right to choose their own alliances, their own political system, in the face of a sort of neo-imperialist Putin who is determined to turn what's left of Ukraine, when he's taken away the Donbass and Crimea, into a client state. So the issues here are very clear, and there's a profound difference now in the way that the Europeans view the Ukraine crisis from the way that, apparently anyway, the Trump administration is approaching it.
Is there any credit due to President Trump, as things stand, for shaking the conflict free of the gridlock in which it had been stuck for seemingly many, many months, that actually, whatever it turns out to be, he has moved it into a new phase?
I think he could have moved it into a new phase by taking a completely different approach. He could have said to Putin, I want good relations with you. This crisis has got to come to an end. We will sit down at the table, and I am going to double down in supporting Ukraine unless you come to an agreement that allows the Ukrainians to live in peace with their sovereign rights in place. And if you won't do that, then I'm going to pile on the pressure. Instead of which, what we have is apparently an American negotiating position where I think it was Joe who said he's already conceded, or at least Pete Hegseth, his defense secretary, has conceded that there will be no NATO membership for Ukraine. There will be no NATO support for Ukraine in terms of implementing any peace deal. And that he's now talking as though the blame for this war, for this invasion, is Ukraine's own. Is at Ukraine's own door. So I don't think he gets any credit at all for the way that he's approaching it at the moment. No.
Yes, a wonderfully generous interpretation there by Callum about how to throw the cards up in the air and let the chips fall where they may. David, how difficult is the role of Marco Rubio in this? We saw him go to Riyadh for those talks with Sergei Lavrov, and that came out with a communique which made the perfectly understandable point about, this needs to be a durable and lasting peace that works for Ukraine as much as Russia, but that is not what is coming out from the Defense Secretary in the United States nor from the President. And at the moment, you get the sense in the United States that it's a little bit operating a little bit like a court. Trump is the king. Everybody is battling for influence and his ear. This is almost an impossible line and a balance for Rubio to strike, isn't it?
I think it's a very good point. I was very struck by the different interpretations that were coming out of Washington on the one hand, and Marco Rubio when he was still in Saudi Arabia before the talks began, about what these talks between Rubio and Lavrov were actually about. If you took the line from Washington, it sounded as though it was inevitable that this was going to lead to early negotiations and an early peace deal, which incidentally will be extraordinarily difficult to deliver, since it's not just the Americans and the Russians who have agency in this. If you listened to Marco Rubio, it was quite different. It was, well, I'm going to go and talk to Lavrov and see whether it's worth having a negotiation. Now, how deep this split is, I don't know. Marco Rubio in the past has had a reputation as being very tough, not just on China, but on Russia. How comfortable he is in the role of telling the Ukrainians effectively that, we will decide what the deal is and whether you want to be at the table or not. I don't know. But I think potentially there are going to be tensions inside the Trump administration. And you're quite right. It seems as though whatever his ministers might argue or how they might want to present policy, it's what Trump decides to say, as it were, to the next press conference. I think the other thing that's interesting is whether the US Congress is going to fall in line over this. Trump has, of course, a majority in both houses, but it's quite narrow. There is, when I last looked, quite a substantial majority of the population in favor of NATO in the United States. It's not clear to me that selling the Ukrainians out would be, if that's how it turned out, would be particularly popular in the United States or an easy sell in Congress. So I think, this has an enormously long way to run. And I think that you're putting your finger on this difference of emphasis is very interesting.
Mm. Mm. Can I ask, David, if you can contrast that, if indeed there is a contrast to be made, with your experience years ago, 20-odd years ago, in the Bush administration and the Bush-Blair relationship? Because it strikes me that the tensions within a presidential administration might be healthy or unhealthy, depending on how you view that. Perhaps it's good to have checks. Perhaps it's obstructive or difficult to have people with different opinions. What was your experience?
I think it depends how you interpret tensions, Callum. But I'm sure a debate inside an administration is very important. Otherwise, all you've got is one-man rule. And that's what you've got in Moscow. And to have a structured and informed discussion about policy making inside anybody's government, not just the government of the United States, is surely essential. And in past, this has also been the way in which the transatlantic relationship has worked. There have been close discussions between allies about big issues. And of course, you don't always agree. And some very difficult calls have to be made. But I think what is so very difficult about the current situation is that you have a president who seems to be, very volatile and very unpredictable, and doesn't seem to listen to or want to listen to the advice of others. And indeed, I suspect that if he gets advice he doesn't like, that is seen not as helpful or constructive, but as destructive.
Can I ask the whether is there potentially in this sort of America first approach that Trump had sort of been elected on, but also has been pursuing, is there a potential that he may underestimate the backlash against the US from other regions? Because he's kind of gone feet first into, it's almost like a sort of double-footed tackle with arms and everything else, and into the Gaza Riviera, this idea of the sort of quite anti-Europe and sort of UK sentiment that's been expressed repeatedly, and that is there potential for, alongside tariffs, for what essentially could happen is a sort of boycott in the future of US products, US companies? Could it be that it would actually have a sort of there's a longer sort of tail or potential risk to all this? Because you must obviously look at other countries and how they may be perceiving this. Is there something that he could be misjudging in his sort of bombastic approach?
I think there is. I think there's bound to be pushback. There's bound to be some sort of backlash. It's not just the question of whether or not he's going to stand by Ukraine, but there are a lot of other issues, and you touched on a couple of them there, Joe, where there will be differences of view. One is the Middle East, one is climate change, and he's already taken the United States out of the Paris Agreement again. There are issues about things like the World Health Organization. There are questions about how you will, deal with the world as a whole, how far you're going to be consultative and cooperative, and how far it's you do it my way or it's the highway. So yes, I think there will be pushback. I mean, there will always be issues, however, about what is the cost of that. And the way that he operates is obviously from a position of strength, making maximum demands and warning that if he doesn't get his way, there is going to be a cost. And it will depend, what is that cost? Is it something that governments or perhaps groups of governments can deal with? Or will they find themselves more or less bound to do what he wants? But I think what you've also got here is something that's much harder to measure, which is the effect on trust. And the difficulty now, I think, in coming to agreements with an administration that is so unpredictable is, do you trust anything they say or they do? And so if we get into a situation where there's constant pressure and constant demands and deals are made, there will then be the question of will they stick? It was, after all, Trump in his first term who insisted on renegotiating the US-Canada-Mexico agreement. He now is tearing that up. He negotiated it. So you'll have this extraordinary approach towards Canada over whether it should become part of the United States, Denmark whether it should surrender Greenland. These are supposed to be close and cooperative allies, and yet they're being treated in a way that I don't think it's too much to say. It's sort of a bullying approach. So how far is there going to be a mood to cooperate? How far is there going to be a fear that even if I do cooperate, it'll never be enough? And I think that it's therefore almost inevitable that people will start to look around, countries will start to look around to see, have they got alternatives? And this can only help China. This is going to be an issue, I think, for the United States. The more that they upset other countries and other groups of countries, the more people will decide, well, I have to reinsure somewhere else. And that in the long run is not going to help the United States.
Can we consider the role of the EU, Europe more widely? I am no great lover, for anyone that listens to this podcast, then I'm no great lover of Boris Johnson, but to his great credit, Boris Johnson has shown remarkable moral clarity where Ukraine is concerned, and has consistently, alongside Zelensky, tried to drag the European Union into more full-throated support for Ukraine, both in terms of finances, tougher sanction regimes, more hardware. Before Trump came in, again, there was a talk about the need for, to Trump-proof the possible election of Donald Trump. And yet, again, we saw the European Union dragging its feet, and actually, for once, us dragging our feet as well, about allowing those long-range missiles to be used to strengthen Ukraine's position and try and claw back as much land before Trump came in. So clearly we knew that this was potentially an issue. Now we are where we are. We see an emergency summit in Paris, which by any measure I think was a bit of a disaster. Poland said, no, we won't commit troops. As Starmer said, we're prepared to put troops on the ground. Olaf Scholz left early, very equivocal about, his role in terms of a peacekeeping force. You might be out of office by next week in any event. If you're Zelensky, one of your strongest allies has just turned tail and let your arch rival in from the cold, and the people that you can still rely on can't seem to be able to find a united position. I mean, what way forward for Europe on this?
I think you put it very well. If you were Zelensky and you're looking at the landscape this morning, you would feel, I think it looked pretty bleak. And I think when you said that he behaved with great restraint this morning, I quite agree on he has got to do the best he can with the problems he's got, which is to try and continue to work with Trump and get some sort of leverage during these negotiations. And he's got to try and encourage the Europeans to do whatever they can to sustain him, while the Americans are apparently so equivocal. The European problem is, in my view, it's not so much an EU problem. It's a problem that European countries, since the end of the Cold War, have pretty much given up on providing adequate funds for their own defense. Trump isn't wrong about that, and he's certainly not the first American to say it. During the Obama administration, Democratic administration, they were warning Europeans that we had to do more, and we haven't done it. So the hollowing out of British armed forces over the last 15 years has completely changed our ability to play a serious role, I think. When it comes to whether or not we're going to argue about putting boots on the ground, I agree with you, all that is embarrassing and awkward. But my own view is it's so far off in terms of this negotiation anyway that it's pretty academic. The fact is, I find it very difficult to imagine that if we get to a peace deal, and that's going to be very difficult, and we might come back to the issue of, how many players there are in this, even if they're not necessarily at the table. But if we get to a peace deal, how that is enforced is very difficult to imagine at the moment. Putin is insisting, in effect, that it won't be enforced. There will be no NATO troops under any flag or any heading that are allowed to enforce it, and Ukraine will remain completely vulnerable. And he may come back for more when he's decided that we've all lost interest again. There's nothing to say that the Ukrainians actually are going to accept this. Doesn't mean to say that they can hang on and win in the long run, but they don't have to sign up to what Trump wants or Putin wants. In parentheses, it's just worth remembering that the Ukrainians went on fighting Soviet-Russian forces after the end of the Second World War well into the 1950s. So the idea that they will necessarily acquiesce in a deal that's done over their heads is, I think, something that we need to think about that rather hard. Nevertheless, of course, they're in a very vulnerable position. Europe needs to take early and urgent measures to increase its defence expenditure, which is a very difficult issue for the British government. It needs to be radical in what it does about finding ways of capitalising its defence industries. Question, should there be a European Defence Bank? Question, should countries start thinking about having a hypothecated extra tax on certain citizens in order to help pay, rather like sort of war loan, for getting ourselves back into some kind of defence order? I mean, whether any leaders in Europe have the appetite to do any of this, I don't know. But you're quite right. Europe is not in a strong position on the battlefield. Having said that, as others have pointed out in the last 24 hours, the 200 billion of the 300 billion of frozen Russian assets are sitting in Europe. And one of the things that the Europeans could do, as Bill Browder has suggested, is to say, well, we're not going to hand these back. We're not going to release our sanctions, which is certainly what Putin desperately wants. We're going to continue to support Ukraine for as long as they want to keep fighting. So it's not just that the Americans and the Russians can turn up and sign some deal, and everybody will necessarily fall in line.
Joe or Kurt, did you want to come in, Joe?
Yeah, I was going to say that the sort of precedent being set for this suggestion that if you're going to help other countries at a time of need, and that somehow there's a debt to repay later on, as has been talked about with Ukraine's minerals and the sort of potential of some sort of payback for support that has been provided so far as has come from Trump, it's a pretty dangerous precedent, really, for how we sort of maintain order in the world longer term. And I guess for a sort of role that you'd have had, it makes for very difficult conversations. And also, really, at what point does any other leader sort of say, hang on, this is not the way we do peace, this is not the way we achieve peace, or we support those in trouble? And it's a bold one that will stand up to that idea, but then it's also very worrying if nobody thinks to speak out on that at all.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's wholly transactional to say, well, we have defended you for 2 or 3 years. You now have to hand over all your raw materials, or $50 billion worth of them, whatever. That's not how the Western community has operated. The Western community has shared values, it's shared principles. It has, where it can, shared its policies, but certainly done its best to make them congruent with one another in the interests of what it sees as an international community based on the rule of law, and been willing to defend that community, whether it's immediately challenged itself or not, because it's in the wider interest. What we have apparently at the moment is an American administration saying that it's not guided by any of those things. This is just about, what can I get out of this and what do you owe me? And that is going to be a completely different world to move into. It's, as others have said, it suggests that it's about a carve up of the world into possible zones of interest. It's about the power of might is right, rather than any concern about the basis of international relations being on the concept of the rule of law. So you're absolutely right. It's an extremely disturbing development, and I do hope very much that Western leaders will stand up and say that.
It's interesting, isn't it? I was thinking about this when I was listening to the J.D. Vance hectoring or lecturing at the Munich Security Conference last week, which obviously went down extremely badly with the audience. And I think the position he was making at the time was a little bit more nuanced than perhaps the media coverage would have conveyed. But the point he was sort of saying about, it's all very well defending Western liberal values against things. What are you defending them for? And here we are a week on. Well, you're not defending them so that one of your strongest allies can then, sell another ally down the river to an evil dictator like like Putin. I think the whole thing's just extraordinary. But back on my issue with the European Union on this, I mean, Germany, how important, and I use this word loosely given what we've seen over the last week, how impactful do you think that the election will be next week in Germany? Germany, by the way, only spends, what was it, 1.5% of its budget on its contribution to NATO, extremely small amount of money. So they do have sympathy with Trump's point around European Union and needing to pull its own weight on its own security to a much greater level, but not at the expense of Ukraine. To make that point is where I part company with him. But do you think the German election is likely to have any potential impact on strengthening Starmer's hand or weakening it further?
I think let us see what the result is. If Merz wins comfortably and can govern effectively, and that suggests, so I'm not a German expert, that you will only need one other coalition partner. If he then takes action to make it possible for the Germans to raise money and release what is technically known as their debt brake, you can imagine a much stronger German leader domestically taking a much more forthright view about how Germany should arm itself and spend its money. And at the same time, that will have impact on how the EU is led, because at the moment we have the situation where both the Germans and the French have very weak government, and there's very little direction from two of the capitals who are absolutely critical. So I do think this election is very important. There's also the issue about how will he get on with Trump. On the face of it, it should be easier for him than with Scholz, because Scholz is a socialist and Merz comes from the centre-right. And certainly that goes down better with Trump and his entourage than the idea of a socialist leadership. So I think all that is important. In defence of the Germans, they do claim that the extra 100 billion that Scholz has found for defence will take them over the 2%. But you're quite right, they're a long way back. And to come back to a point we were all discussing earlier, even if countries get to 2% or they get to 2.5%, the point that Trump and other Americans have been making is this is not adequate. And if you go back to the Cold War period, let's say period of sort of the 60s, 70s and 80s, Britain itself was spending between 4 and 5% of GDP on defence. Well, at the moment, we're spending 2.3 and promising one of these days that we might get to 2.5. But probably the polls are right when they're saying they're already spending 4 and they need to spend, probably that much again. So I think the whole question is whether Europe is willing to grasp this issue, that it needs to provide the wherewithal to defend itself, irrespective of what the Americans are going to do. And that's a pretty big leap at the moment, especially when growth rates are so low and priorities are on social spending for an aging population. But this is a moment when political leaders are going to have to decide how brave they're going to be and how far they are willing, both inside the EU and elsewhere in Europe, to grasp this nettle.
And we see, obviously, Starmer will be going to Washington next week. He's self-styled himself as the bridge between the United States and the European Union. When I hear of people calling themselves a bridge, I think about being walked over. But nevertheless, it's quite a tall order for Starmer next week, isn't it? What, if anything, can he achieve?
I think it's a very important visit. We are told, and I have absolutely no inside knowledge, that the relationship at the moment is quite good between him and Trump. He's not the only European leader, incidentally, who apparently has quite good lines out to Trump. We know that Mrs. Meloni does from Italy. My own view, for what it's worth, is that I would see this as part reconnaissance and part an attempt at persuasion. This is an opportunity for the Prime Minister to go across and see what is Trump's mood? What is going on insofar as he can establish that inside this administration? And what is Trump actually thinking that he's, insofar as it's not on public display? And where are the opportunities then to discuss the issues and perhaps affect the way Trump thinks about international relations? I mean, the priority obviously will be for the relationship with the UK, but it's much wider than that for all the reasons we've been discussing. So I think that there is an opportunity here for him to make an assessment about how he sees this administration shaping up, what areas there are where he can engage, where is it going to be possible to engage in ways that help shape that relationship, help make it more cooperative, more predictable, reinforce the sorts of relationships with American presidents we've had before? Or are we actually at a break point? Is this a moment when this is simply not going to be possible? So I'm sure that I like you, I'm not terribly keen on that I'd like to be a bridge idea. But I think coming back from that with that sort of immediate exposure to President Trump and able to talk to other European leaders, by that stage we will have a new German leader, that I think is valuable, and that the Europeans will need to sit down and decide, how can they approach this, and very much on the basis of what Prime Minister's heard, what actually is going on as far as Russia is concerned. If we are going to, in effect, be in a world in which the American guarantee for European security has gone, we are in a very different and very chilly landscape indeed.
David, you've been very generous with your time, and we are nearly finished. I just want to confirm something I think you just said there, that it remains to be seen what happens in the Washington, D.C. meeting in a week or so. But is there a concern from you that the special relationship may be at breaking point?
I don't want to be as dramatic as that, Callum.
Yeah.
There are elements in the bilateral relationship which are really very profoundly embedded, and the cooperation on intelligence, on nuclear issues, on the military issues is very, very deep-seated. And those sorts of relationships are probably, able to withstand differences at the top of politics. But if we do find that we have a president who really isn't interested in sustaining the transatlantic relationship, doesn't share the sort of values that have been absolutely central to our relationship for the last 50, 70 years, I think it will be difficult to go on saying that there is something particularly special about it. Of course, we'll have a close relationship, and we will need that. But if you don't agree on Ukraine, you don't agree on NATO, you don't agree on Russia handling, you don't agree on the Middle East, you don't agree on climate change, you don't agree on the whole question of, as it were, multilateral engagement across the world, that's an awfully long list. And so I think we have to be realistic. Now, I hope it's not going to come to that. And I think, as I did mention earlier on, I think, don't forget, there are an awful lot of people in the American system outside the Trump administration who attach a lot of importance to the relationship with Britain, to the relationship with Western partners. These people will have agency as well. So, let's leap to conclusions. But I certainly don't want to sit here and pretend I don't think there are very serious challenges.
I feel like we can't have you here, David, without asking the question of, given this is such a seismic sort of period that we're in, it's so important, it could have really big lasting effects. Are you kind of relieved not to be in the job, or is there part of you that wishes you could be back involved and sort of influencing in a bigger way?
I think you need to know when your time is up. I don't think I should feel that if I were there, I could do anything very particular that other people aren't doing. So I worry, and I'm very concerned about what's happening, and I'm very dismayed about a lot of what's happening. But I don't feel that, my goodness me, if I were in there, I'd be able to sort this out. I think that would be very pretentious of me.
Is there part of you that would like to have a go? There's a different question. Not necessarily that you do it better, but is there part of you that thinks, oh, this is one I'd really like to get stuck in on?
I think you can try and be useful from the outside too, I think it's always very difficult if you're inside the government to say things that are not, I don't want to say the party line, but both you and others, and Kirsty and Callum will understand. You of course have to be as supportive as you can and be very careful with how honest you are. In some ways, it's easier to be outside and to say, we're in a very, very high risk period. And whatever the official line is here, we shouldn't kid ourselves. And we have got some very, very big challenges to deal with. And we're going to need some very brave policies, in my view.
Sir David Manning, we'll have to leave it there. We've already taken enough of your time, but we're extremely grateful for your expertise and insight and experience. So thank you very much. Thanks for joining us.
Pleasure.